All right, so get this. We've got some intel on Ukraine, and let me tell you, it paints a pretty wild picture.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking Zelenskyy, making some pretty out there moves. Trump throwing curveballs with that whole mineral wealth thing.
All right.
And this whole idea of a soft landing. That could actually be a huge loss for Ukraine and the West.
Yeah, buckle up.
Seriously.
It's definitely a situation where things are not always as they appear.
No kidding.
So maybe let's start with Zelenskyy. His stance on territorial concessions has been...
evolving.
Yeah, evolving, to say the least.
That's one way to put it.
To say the least.
First, it was like not an inch of land.
Right.
And now he's offering to just hand cursed back to Russia in exchange for, well, we don't really know what.
Yeah.
And to get this, Moscow just laughed it off.
Oh, wow.
They basically said they'd never trade their own territory.
It really highlights the power dynamic here.
Yeah.
Russia seems to hold most of the cards, Leaving Zelenskyy scrambling for options, he even brought up the idea of Ukraine needing nuclear weapons.
Oh, wow.
Which, let's be real, that's a long shot.
It feels like he's getting more and more desperate as this goes on.
Yeah.
Especially with the situation on the ground, going downhill and the West's support. Well, it's getting kind of shaky.
For sure.
Particularly since Trump won the election.
Yeah.
And his whole America First thing.
Right.
Speaking of Trump.
Yes.
He's claiming that the U.S. has poured a whopping $350 billion into Ukraine.
Wow.
With Europe adding another $100 billion on top of that.
Okay.
And now he wants to see a return on that investment. Specifically, $500 billion worth of Ukraine's mineral wealth.
$500 billion?
Yeah, $500 billion.
Wow.
Wait, did Zelenskyy actually agree to this?
Well...
Giving up that much mineral wealth seems like a huge concession.
It does raise a lot of questions.
Like what?
Well, what exactly are the terms of this deal?
Right.
And how could it even be enforced, especially with Russia likely to just ignore it and keep pushing?
Yeah, it's a total mess. And then there's this whole talk about security guarantees for Ukraine.
Yeah.
But nobody seems to agree on what that actually means.
Right.
Some folks are talking direct military intervention. Others are saying just material support.
Yeah.
It's all very vague.
Yeah, it's all very vague. And there's even a proposal to bring in 200,000 peacekeepers.
There's just 1,000.
But here's the kicker. The U.S. Secretary of Defense Hegseth is saying these troops wouldn't be from NATO.
Really?
So Article 5 wouldn't apply.
So basically no real protection from a Russian attack.
Pretty much.
I mean, that makes sense from the U.S. perspective, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to avoid a direct conflict with Russia at all costs.
Right.
But would Russia even accept peacekeepers NATO or not?
Highly doubtful they see any Western presence in Ukraine as a direct threat, and they've been adamant about Ukraine not joining NATO from the very beginning.
It all paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, that analysts are saying a Russian victory is inevitable at this point.
Yeah.
Which would be a huge political hit for the West, especially for Trump.
For sure.
So what's the best case scenario then?
Honestly, the best case scenario right now might be accepting Russia's demands and trying to salvage whatever's left of Ukraine.
Yeah,
which is a pretty tragic outcome considering the West's involvement in the first place.
It does feel like the West's push for NATO expansion, especially that decision back in 2008 to eventually bring Ukraine into the fold. Well, it was a colossal mistake. That kind of set the stage for this whole disaster.
And the consequences of that decision are going to reverberate for a long time, even if things somehow calm down now.
Okay, so Ukraine is a powder keg, but things aren't exactly peaceful in the Middle East either.
No.
Trump's issued a new ultimatum to Hamas about the hostages they're holding.
Oh, right.
He set a deadline and threatened all hell if they don't comply.
All hell.
That's a quote.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous game of chicken for sure.
It is.
We don't know if he's serious about the threat or just posturing, but Hamas might actually be open to negotiation this time.
Yeah, maybe.
Then again, Netanyahu's under a lot of pressure to get those hostages back.
Right.
It's a tough spot for both sides. And then there's Trump's controversial proposal to relocate Palestinians from Gaza while the Strip is being rebuilt.
Yeah, that's a non-starter for a lot of Arab and Islamic countries, especially Jordan and Egypt. They see it as ethnic cleansing, and frankly, it's hard to argue with that assessment. Plus, there are a ton of logistical and ethical issues with such a plan. It would definitely face massive international backlash.
It's a complicated mess with no easy answers.
No easy answers.
But let's shift back to Ukraine for a second.
Sure. What specifically?
I'm curious about John Mearsheimer's take on all of this.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, his analysis is the whole reason we're doing this deep dive.
Right. Yes, Mearsheimer, he's known for his...
unconventional views.
Yeah, unconventional views, but,
to put it mildly.
Yeah, to put it mildly.
But his analysis of the situation in Ukraine...
Right.
It's particularly thought-provoking.
Yeah, he basically blames the West for the whole mess, saying that, the push for NATO expansion was a huge provocation to Russia.
Like they were speaking different languages?
Yeah.
Totally different understandings of the situation.
Right. He argues that the West, especially the U.S., they failed to grasp Russia's perspective. They saw NATO expansion as a purely defensive measure,
Right.
but Russia viewed it as an existential threat, a direct challenge to their security interests.
And Mearsheimer uses historical examples.
Oh, yeah.
Like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
To illustrate how dangerous it is to mess with a major power's sense of security.
Exactly. His argument is that by relentlessly pushing for NATO expansion, the West backed Russia into a corner, leaving them with few options other than to respond with force.
It's a perspective that's not often heard in mainstream media.
Right.
But it's important to consider.
For sure. And he's pretty harsh on Western leaders, too, saying they've been blinded by ideology and have seriously underestimated Russia's resolve.
So basically, he thinks they really messed up.
He believes it has led to a series of miscalculations and strategic blunders culminating in the current crisis.
So not a lot of hope for a peaceful resolution, then.
Mearsheimer doesn't offer easy solutions. In fact, he's quite pessimistic about the prospects for a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, he seems to think a Russian victory is pretty much inevitable.
Yeah.
Which would leave Ukraine in ruins.
Right.
And the West humiliated.
And even if a ceasefire is reached, he believes it will be fragile and temporary with the underlying tensions,
simmering just below the surface.
Exactly. It's a sobering assessment, but one that's grounded in his understanding of history and geopolitics.
Makes sense.
He stresses the importance of clear-eyed diplomacy and a willingness to compromise.
Right.
Though whether that's even possible in the current climate is anyone's guess.
It's all pretty heavy stuff. One thing that struck me while going through all this is the human element.
Yeah.
I mean, here's Zelenskyy, a comedian, just a few years ago. And now he's leading a nation at war, making life or death decisions.
Right.
Can you imagine the pressure?
It's an incredible story and a testament to how unpredictable history can be. The weight of responsibility on his shoulders must be immense.
Yeah.
Every decision he makes has huge consequences. And he's doing it all while facing a superpower's military might.
It makes his recent actions, his sometimes seemingly desperate proposals, a bit more understandable, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even powerful leaders are human with their own vulnerabilities and limitations.
Right.
We tend to put them on pedestals, but they're just people trying to navigate incredibly complex and challenging situations.
So true. Right. We've talked about Ukraine, the Middle East, the role of the West. It's a lot to take in. What are your biggest takeaways from all of this?
Well, it's clear we're living in a multipolar world. Now, power isn't concentrated in one place anymore, like it was after the Cold War. New powers like China are rising.
Right.
Old rivalries are resurfacing.
Yeah.
And the global landscape is shifting in some pretty dramatic ways.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of rapid technological change, economic uncertainty, and the looming climate crisis.
It's a volatile mix that's generating anxiety and uncertainty around the world.
And people are feeling insecure about the future.
For sure.
And that can lead to a retreat from global engagement, a rise in nationalism, and a hardening of ideological divides.
Quite in turn makes it even harder to tackle the complex global challenges we face.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it is.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
How do we break out of this cycle and create a more stable and prosperous world?
That's the million-dollar question. We need new ways of thinking, new approaches to diplomacy, and a renewed commitment to cooperation.
Right.
We can't rely on the old paradigms that no longer reflect the realities of the 21st century.
We need a more nuanced understanding of how power works.
Yeah.
A more inclusive approach to international relations.
For sure.
And a greater focus on dialogue and diplomacy.
And we need to address the root causes of conflict.
Right.
The inequalities, the injustices, the historical grievances that fuel resentment and violence. It's a tall order.
Yeah.
But it's what's needed to build a more just and peaceful world.
Okay, big picture stuff aside, what have we learned from this specific deep dive into Ukraine and the tangled web of global politics?
Well, it's reinforced the fact that the world is an incredibly complex and interconnected place where actions in one region can have ripple effects across the globe.
Right.
We've also seen how past decisions like the push for NATO expansion can have unintended and long-lasting consequences.
It's a reminder that the human element is always present.
Right.
Even in the seemingly abstract realm of geopolitics, leaders are human. They make mistakes. They operate under pressure.
For sure.
And understanding that can help us make sense of their actions.
We've learned a lot, but this is just a starting point.
Right.
There's so much more to explore and understand.
So for you listening, what's the takeaway? What does all this mean for your life, your work, your future?
That's a question only you can answer, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some new perspectives, challenged some assumptions, and sparked your curiosity to learn more.
The more we understand the world around us, the better equipped we are to navigate its complexities and shape our own destinies. But this deep dive isn't over yet.
Oh, right.
We've still got a lot to unpack, so stay tuned. Okay, so let's circle back to where we started. You sent us a ton of material on Ukraine, and honestly, it's a lot more complicated than just those surface-level headlines you see everywhere.
Yeah.
Zelenskyy trying to make deals, Trump wanting a piece of the pie, the whole peacekeeper idea, and how that 2008 decision about NATO is haunting everything.
Yeah, it really is. What strikes me is how everything is connected. You can't really understand what's happening in Ukraine without knowing the history, the personalities involved, and the bigger geopolitical forces at play.
So if you had to pick one thing for listeners to really grasp from all this, what would it be?
Oh, that's tough to choose. I think the most important takeaway is that Ukraine is trapped in a power struggle that's way bigger than they are.
Right.
They've become a pawn in a game between major powers.
Yeah.
And their fate is being decided by forces outside their control.
It's a heavy realization. It makes you wonder if Zelenskyy even has any real agency.
Right.
Even though he's trying his best to navigate this crisis.
Exactly. And it makes you question the West's role in all of this. Was pushing for NATO expansion the right move?
Right.
Or did it unintentionally lead to the current situation?
Those are some tough questions with no easy answers, but we need to be asking them if we want to avoid repeating these mistakes in the future.
Absolutely. This deep dive has just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
But it's given us a framework for understanding this incredibly complex situation. And it's clear that the decisions made in the coming months, even weeks, will have a huge impact, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
Wow. That's a lot to think about.
It is.
It's intense, thought-provoking, and definitely makes you want to keep learning more.
For sure. The more we understand, the better equipped we are to make sense of the world.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe even play a role in shaping a better future.
Fingers crossed. This has been a fascinating deep dive. We appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Remember, this is just the start of the conversation. There's always more to uncover. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. CHCC and CFER.